All right, so thank you all so much for joining us for More Than Just Rockets, How NASA Studies the Earth System. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Liz Hoy, who has been a scientist at NASA for over 10 years and has been studying Arctic systems since 2005. Her research interests are in geography and disturbance mapping within the high northern latitude regions of North America, where she utilizes GIS and remote sensing to understand aspects of environmental change. When not hiking in the forests of Alaska for field work, you can find Liz spending time on the rivers near the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. So all 100 plus of us who are watching live, about 125 of us, and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give Liz a big virtual round of applause for being with us this afternoon. And Liz, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. Thank you all for attending today and for inviting me to come and talk with you. I'm just delighted to be here. These talks are so fun, and it's great to have such a wonderful audience from such diverse locations joining in virtually. So Robert had asked me to give you a talk on kind of Earth system science at NASA. What's NASA's perspective on Earth system science? And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to spend some of the time just kind of going over what NASA does to study Earth science. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the particular project that I work on in northern latitudes in high Arctic areas like Alaska and Canada, and go into a little bit more research there. And so I've titled this topic, More Than Just Rockets, How NASA Studies the Earth System. So oftentimes when we think about NASA, we're thinking about rockets going into outer space. We're thinking about, what's happening on the moon and other planets and the solar system and galaxies. You're thinking about, the James Webb Space Telescope looking out into the galaxies and universe around us. But NASA, some of those rockets that shoot off into the outer space are actually putting out satellites that are looking back at Earth. So part of NASA's mission is to study the Earth around us, and I'm going to focus in on that today. And so that's why I've chosen this picture as my opening slide to give you a little bit of a perspective on what NASA's studying related to the Earth. So we see this astronaut holding a child's hand. And you see some of the Earth system represented in this picture. We have the sun in the back, we see the atmosphere, the sky, but we have this beautiful biosphere where we have all of these plants and animals. And they don't show a lot of water in this picture, but we know that there's water there to keep all of this life. And so this is kind of showcasing a little bit of what NASA studies. This was a picture that they made for Earth Day earlier this year in April. We just had the 50th celebration of Earth Day a few years ago, and NASA really tries to do a lot to get people excited about Earth, because we're not just space science, we're also Earth science. So let's see, there we go. Thinking about what is the Earth system? How do all these pieces fit together? So the Earth system is really composed of these 5 parts. We have the atmosphere, the cryosphere, like the ice and glaciers. We have the biosphere, that's where we are, where life is. We have the geosphere, which is what's happening on the surface of the Earth or inside the Earth. And then, of course, the hydrosphere, looking at all the water. And of course, all of these different pieces are interconnected. They're always interconnected. You can't have a cryosphere without the hydrosphere, because everything related to cold, frozen water is still water. So it's still part of the hydrosphere. Your atmosphere has clouds in it. That's related to water. Your biosphere has trees in it. They all rely on water. So all of these pieces are connected with one another, and NASA tries to look at all of them. There are some focus areas that I'll go through to try to give you some information about what NASA's doing, but just keep in mind that they really are all together anyways. So NASA has these different questions that they're trying to answer in terms of Earth science. We're looking at how is the Earth changing? What's causing these different changes? How will Earth change in the future? and how can the Earth system science provide societal benefit? And I think that piece is really important. We're not just doing research to have research done. We're doing research to see where humans fit in all of this and how our research can help the rest of us here on Earth. And I think that's what I see as my role at NASA is, and I think many of the scientists at NASA, we feel this way. We're trying to provide the best science possible so that we can give that information to policymakers and land managers so that they can make decisions about what's right for their area where they're managing land. And on the left here are just some representations of different data sets that can be used to study the Earth system. And I think I'll go through them on the next page a little bit more. So this is a visualization showing some of the different data sets that come from NASA, where you can see kind of the Earth system in action. So these are all coming from different satellites that NASA has, and I'll show some of them more on the next page. But you can see soil moisture comes from one of our satellites. We have precipitation that's looking at the hydrosphere. Clouds are hydrosphere again. Here we have precipitation and water. And a lot of these different satellite measures that we use are then fed into different models. We have some supercomputers at NASA where we can kind of synthesize and crunch those numbers for all the different satellite data sets and try to put together these global pictures of what's happening across the Earth. So I like this visualization. I have a few more throughout the talk too, just to kind of give you an idea of what NASA is doing and what data sets we have. All right, so here's a look at some of the different satellites that NASA has. And NASA has over 20 satellites that are in orbit around the Earth, just looking back down at the Earth to understand different aspects of the Earth system. So some of these satellites are what we call geostationary satellites. So they're always looking at the same place on Earth. So one of the ones we launched recently is called Tempo, and it's looking at air quality across the United States. And it is looking at that every day, all the time, when it's able to see. Can't really see it as well in the dark, but it's always looking at the United States. And then we have other satellites that you'll see kind of on this graphic that they are going, we call them polar orbiting satellites that kind of spin around our poles. And as the Earth moves, we're getting different pictures across the Earth's surface. So these satellites are all looking at different things. Some are looking at vegetation, where are the trees, where are fires, we were able to see that, what's happening with precipitation. We are looking at air quality, as I mentioned. So really trying to understand lots of different parts of the Earth system and how it's impacting us. There we go. This is just another view showing a number of the different satellites that NASA has looking back at the Earth. And I won't go into all of them, but I'll just give you an idea. So if you look at the kind of the outer ring of satellites, this is showing you some of them are future missions. They're kind of in yellow and orange, kind of down the bottom. These are missions that we're planning on sending out and getting ready. And these vary from different types of radar to satellites specifically focused on fire. Some are just Earth imaging satellites, like this one called Landsat Next. And then you get into kind of around the outer edge on the left here in the 2020s, what we have currently up there now. A lot of these are looking at precipitation and also kind of elevation height. We're looking at Landsat is looking at kind of lots of different aspects about forests and land cover. And going back, this shows all the way up to, we still have instruments that are orbiting Earth that have been up there since 1995. So some of these satellites have really gotten a lot of use out of them. If we look also, we have instruments on the International Space Station. So this is also a really great platform for us to use. We've had some instruments that have been up there for a couple of years now, and every few years those instruments cycle on and off, but we get some really amazing imagery from the space station itself too. Okay, oh, I don't know why that went over there. So what I wanted to spend some time on now is looking at the the different focus areas that NASA has to study the Earth system. And there are 5 or 6, and we'll go through each one. So the first one is atmospheric composition. And I'm not sure why my title moved off the screen, but for some reason it did. But with atmospheric composition, this is an advanced understanding of the changes in the Earth's radiation balance and air quality and the ozone layer that result from changes in atmospheric composition. And to give you an example of how NASA is studying atmospheric composition, I've shown some of the wildfires from this year. And I think all of you probably in Massachusetts were as affected as I was in Maryland by wildfire and smoke from these Canadian wildfires, especially those in Quebec earlier this past summer, where that smoke was traveling hundreds of miles. And then sometimes the smoke can even travel thousands of miles, and is really influencing us where we are living here on the East Coast, in a spot that is not always impacted by wildfire smoke. So this particulate matter, this PM 2.5, is very small, and it can get into our respiratory systems, but it can also impact some people's hearts. And so it's very important to understand where there's degraded air quality and how that smoke is traveling and being transported. So this picture here on the left is taken from a satellite that's a NASA satellite in conjunction with a NOAA satellite, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They also have a number of different satellites. And so this was really a partnership between those 2 agencies to have this satellite. And so I just wanted to kind of show you that this is one of the aspects that NASA is really studying when it comes to the Earth system. And we make a lot of visualizations to try to understand the transport of, in this case, carbon monoxide from wildfires. And this is from this summer, looking at where this wildfire smoke was generated, and then where it has traveled throughout the continent. So we use our supercomputers to make these visualizations, and then we can show them to people and pass them along and really try to analyze them and understand where the smoke is going. Okay, the next part of the Earth system that NASA is studying is weather and atmospheric dynamics. And so here I am showing Hurricane Idalia from just I guess last month, right about a month ago today, actually, August 29th, 2023. And this picture is from the International Space Station, looking down at the hurricane as it was getting ready to make landfall in Florida. And I also wanted to show just a visualization where you can see the wind field from Hurricane Idalia, which is, there it is as it got to Florida. And then you can see also Hurricane Franklin as it's moving up the coast. So NASA is looking at weather and trying to understand how the weather and the atmosphere are interacting together. All right. The next area that I wanted to touch on is the carbon cycle and ecosystems. And there's so much research happening in carbon cycle and ecosystems. This is actually the part of NASA that I work in. I work in the terrestrial ecology program, which is one of a few focus areas within the carbon cycle and ecosystems focus area at NASA. Of course, there's lots of different groups working on different parts of the science that's happening at NASA. So this is kind of the one that I call home. And there were many options to kind of visualize how NASA is studying carbon cycle and ecosystems, but I've just chosen to put one here. And then as we get into the second part of my talk, I'll show a little bit more in depth about my research up in Arctic areas, and you'll see a little bit more about the carbon cycle and ecosystems area at NASA. But here, what I wanted to show is looking at mapping global salt marsh loss and its carbon impact. And so this is an area of China on the Yangtze River. And what you can see here is that over the last 20 years, there has been great change in the location and distribution of salt marshes across the landscape. So in the left picture, we're looking at 20 years ago, so around 2000, and now we're looking at about 2020 on the right. So you can see that some areas have had an increase in salt marsh. So from looking at the bottom here, this little island here has now a large salt marsh expansion. This other island here, Hengsha Island, has grown larger. There's a tidal flood conversion, but other areas in this image show the drainage and conversion of salt marshes into farmland. Why do we care about salt marshes? Salt marshes can protect us from storms. They hold a lot of carbon, and they can just be very beneficial to the ecosystem, to kind of filtering out some of the sediment. And so it's very important to keep an eye on salt marshes. Right now, I've shown this quote that the world has lost 561 square miles of salt marshes over the past 20 years. But it can be complicated to measure that. So a team of researchers came together and tried to understand where are we gaining salt marshes and where are we losing salt marshes. And to do this, they used the NASA satellites called the Landsat series. And I've just kind of shown a little visual of what Landsat looks like down here on the right. But this is a satellite where I like to think about this satellite and think about the fact that this satellite and its predecessors, there's a group of them called Landsat. They've been in orbit. One of them has been in orbit since 1984. So if you think about a photo album of your children or your friends' children, or you think about a little baby growing up and you're flipping through pictures of that photo album until they're 50 years old, that's essentially the amount of information we have through this Landsat satellite program. We're able to look at Earth 50 years ago in this high level of detail where you can see this salt marsh change for 50 years across the entire Earth surface, all of the land areas. And so now that we're in this age of really advanced computing, where we have access to a lot of compute time and space, we can take that entire record of Landsat imagery, and teams of researchers can comb through it and try to understand where do we have even just these salt marshes across the world. And so that's what this map shows. And you can see areas that have gained salt marshes over time are in kind of this green color, and areas that have lost it, salt marshes, are in this blue color. And I've only shown this example of salt marshes, but the same is true for many other characteristics across the landscape. So you can look at mangroves or at croplands or other types of land cover and just see how it's changed over 50 years using this Landsat series of imagery. Another aspect that NASA is studying is climate variability and change. And so here I'm showing Arctic sea ice. This is also some recent research showing that sea ice extent this year in September of 2023 is the lowest sea ice maximum that has been recorded since 1979, when these measurements started to be made. And so on the right, actually, first, if you look at the picture, you can see that what we have this year is shown in white, the sea ice around Antarctica. And then that kind of orange line is showing what the median ice age is over the past 50, well, between 1981 and 2010. So over that 30-year time period, you can see that ice extent used to always be a little larger than it is now. And on the left is just a graph showing this year in blue, showing that this year we have a lot less sea ice than we have in past years. And so NASA has scientists looking at this. We partner with academic groups, with scientists at schools and universities, and also internationally. We partner with teams. We also partner with other federal agencies to look at this and measure this and analyze this. And with all the research, it's not just NASA scientists, it's teams of researchers across the country and sometimes internationally as well. Okay, and then we also are looking at the water and energy cycle. And so here I'm showing sea surface temperatures. This goes along with our Antarctic sea ice. So here you're able to see that what we're seeing is a real increase in sea surface temperatures over time. And so down in the bottom left, we're just, let's see if that's playing. Yeah, we're just looking at sea surface temperature modeled across the world. This comes from different satellite imagery. And also we can use buoy data and ship's record data to try to understand these temperatures. And then up on the right, I'm just showing sea surface temperature at one across one day, what it's looking like over time and how it's changing. And so I've put a quote in here from Dr. Gavin Schmidt, who's the director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which is actually up in New York. And he says, over the long term, we're seeing more heat and warmer sea surface temperatures. And pretty much everywhere is where this is happening. So we're seeing globally increases in the temperatures of our oceans. And this is, of course, impacting the temperatures all across the world. So NASA is right in the thick of studying that as well. I think this is the last kind of area I was going to touch on, was how NASA studies the Earth system. We also are looking at Earth's surface and interior. And this also, NASA has an applied sciences program as well. And part of what the applied sciences program does is they have a program that's really trying to get real-time information on landslides and earthquakes. And then we are trying to direct kind of some of our imagery analysis work to areas that are having significant issues. So on the left, I'm showing a landslide in Haiti that's from a few years ago, I think 2021. And then on the right is just this horrible earthquake that was in Morocco just last month, September 8th. And let's see, I'm going to just flip back and forth a little. So this is imagery before the landslide in Haiti, about like 2 weeks before the landslides. And then here's with the landslides, and you can see just the dramatic impact that those landslides had across that region. There's also a lot of cloud cover in the second image, but this comes from the Landsat satellite that I was mentioning before. That's a big one that a lot of people use. One thing I should mention about NASA data is that as this is paid for by taxpayer dollars here in the US, it is made freely available. So all of this satellite imagery, actually anyone could go and download it. Sometimes people even take it and download it and use it in artwork because it is freely available, can be used for scientific use, and it's used by researchers all over the world. And I'll just mention that this map on the right showing this devastation in Morocco, this was developed. It's a map that was created out of an Earth Observatory group in Singapore using software that was developed at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab in California. And it actually is using data from a European satellite constellation. So it was a real team effort of individuals working from different groups throughout the world to try to map where some of the most damage would be from this earthquake so that resources could be diverted there. Okay, a little bit more about earth science in action. I wanted to just spend a minute or two just talking about the application of NASA earth science data for the farming community. I do a lot with 4-H. Both of my kids are involved in 4-H, so I think a lot about farming now, more than I ever did before. I live in a suburban area. We don't have a lot of farming around us, so I wanted to highlight this for folks. So we actually have at NASA what we call an early adopter program, where we work with different companies who might be interested in our data. And NASA actually works with John Deere and some other large farming corporations as we develop new satellites. And we have these groups that are looking to better understand how they might be able to incorporate this information into their kind of workflows. So up here at the top in these circles are different satellites that NASA uses. Landsat, which I've mentioned. GPM is the Global Precipitation Monitoring Mission. So we're looking at rainfall and just other types of precipitation. And then SMAP is a soil moisture radar instrument. So that's where we're sending a beam down, or we're sending a wave down to the earth, and then it's being scattered back. And we're able to understand by being able to figure out how long that's taken and how much our instrument has moved, we can understand kind of what we're hitting when our wave hits that. And so this is actually looking at soil moisture. So you're able to see how wet or dry the soil is, which can be very important in farmland or farming. And so NASA is able to share the data from these different satellites with teams that are looking at when should we plant our seeds, how long do our crops need to grow for, when is the right time to harvest. And NASA's also developed some models that go along with these satellite data sets to help the farming community inform when they might want to think about planting or harvesting. And these data sets are also used to look at food security in other parts of the world, just to help teams figure out some of these aspects of farming. Okay. And then I wanted to just, let's see if this is going to play. Yeah. Thinking ahead, where does NASA go with Earth system science? So this is a new observatory that NASA is developing, which would consist of multiple satellite sensors to look at what we're calling the Earth System Observatory, these interconnected core missions. This came out of a forward-looking document that was put together by the National Academies of Science for NASA, really trying to understand where we might go with our research and what we might want to look into next. And so this brings together all the different parts of the Earth system. So I'll just go through it with you as it kind of, see if it's, we're going to keep going through. There we go. So clouds and precipitation, that's the hydrosphere, having a sensor that looks at that. Then moving into aerosols, this is our atmosphere, trying to better understand what particles we have in the atmosphere. Moving into mass change, this is a little bit looking at the kind of, and then surface deformation and change, looking at the surface of the Earth. And then the surface biology and geology, really understanding some of the ecosystems of Earth. That really kind of brings us into really understanding all the different parts of the Earth system with this, observatory, which would consist of multiple satellites. So some of these satellites are now in development as NASA moves forward and thinks about where we're going to go into the future. So that's going to bring me into kind of the end of the first part of my talk, just looking at how does NASA study the Earth system. And now I'm going to move into the second part of my talk, where I'm going to talk in a little bit more depth about the part of the Earth system that I am studying. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to start big picture. So we're looking at the interconnected Earth system. We're going to do a case study in northern environments. And what we like to say about this is that what happens in the north doesn't stay in the north. So there are feedbacks and interconnections between the local level, the regional level, and global systems when we're talking about climate change in northern regions. So northern regions are warming at about 3 to 4 times the rate at other parts on Earth. And that is causing many different changes across the landscape there. We are seeing an increase in wildfire extent and amount. We're seeing changes to permafrost, where we have this soil that is actually thawing. And as it thaws, it releases more carbon into the atmosphere. We're seeing changes with the wildlife in this region, and big changes for people that live in this region. They might not be able to hunt at the same time of year in the same locations. They might have a harder time finding food. And so really trying to understand what is happening in this region and how does it impact both the people that live there and the people outside of that region. One example is, of course, with wildfires, where we just showed how wildfires in northern areas, the smoke is blowing down to where we live in the East Coast, and we're affected. So just to show this, what we have in these northern regions is oftentimes very old and slow carbon that was once in the atmosphere, but now it has been taken up by what are these thick soils, thick organic soils, and that's in the top left. This is kind of a cool picture because it shows the pipeline in the corner, and you can see a truck on this road that's dedicated really for pipeline usage. But these forests here are have a lot of carbon stored in them. But as we have this global temperature change, we're seeing these forests become drier and more available to burn and have more permafrost that's thawing. And this is related to the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere from other purposes, like you know, as we drive or as we use coal. So there are changes that are happening. And this is even visible from the space station. So here's a picture from the International Space Station looking at nighttime lights across the globe. And you can see the aurora borealis in the distance. You can see kind of that green color. And so we can see this from space. We can see that there are more people here than there ever used to be, using more electricity at night. And the result is that we're releasing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So that's where our project comes in. This is called the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment. I call it ABOVE for short, or NASA ABOVE. And one aspect of earth science research that NASA does that I had not mentioned yet, but I wanted to bring it up on the slide, is that we do these large field campaigns where we have teams on the ground, we have teams in the air, and we use satellite imagery to really understand what's happening in depth at a small scale that then can be scaled up to global measurements that we can put into models and look at what's happening globally. So our project is looking at Alaska and Western Canada. You can see it in the center, kind of in this white box where we are working. And we have over 100 teams that are part of this project, over 1,000 people overall over the last eight or 9 years. We have about 1 or 2 more years left. It's an over 10-year campaign that's funded by the Terrestrial Ecology focus area at NASA. And really trying to look in depth to understand all of the different changes that are occurring across these areas in Alaska and Canada, this Arctic and boreal forests is what we call these northern forests. And we're really trying to understand the causes of change, how it's impacting ecosystems, ecosystem services. That would be like what animals and plants are there that are important to the people that live in the region, and then all the rest of us not actually living in Alaska. And then how social systems are impacting this. How are people a part of this system, and how are we influencing the system at the same time? So as I mentioned, to do this research, we have teams in the field. That's a picture of myself in the white shirt and one of my colleagues. We're taking soil moisture measurements, and we'll compare those soil moisture measurements with measurements from our airplane. This is me on the left here. We've just gotten off of one of our airplanes to do a flight to understand what soil moisture is from the air. And we're comparing that with the soil moisture we find on the ground, which we're then able to scale up. And you say, well, what's important about soil moisture? Soil moisture helps us to understand where permafrost is thawing. We're able to see where fire disturbance has been worse and then other places. And we can use that kind of information to help us better understand and model where carbon is being emitted and where we might see the most severe changes on the landscape. This is another picture that I just think is a lot of fun and wanted to share with you, showing where some of the different some of the different airborne sensors that we're using. So here on the left, this is one of our NASA planes, and this is our radar pod. I hope you can see my mouse. This is our radar pod where we're sending out pulses of energy, and they're being returned to us, and we're able to understand kind of where, as I was saying, soil moisture might be changing. We can look at elevation with that. And we worked in this situation, we worked with an instrument from the German Space Agency, then they were trying to better understand and model methane across the landscape. And so we flew our aircrafts at roughly the same time, and it was a great opportunity to come together and do this international collaboration. So what can we use this information for? And what we've really been able to do throughout the length of our campaign is to better model hydrology and permafrost. Hydrology, remember, we're thinking about in earth science, but that's the hydrosphere, and permafrost, that's the terrestrial areas, biosphere, and also the hydrosphere. On the left here, we're just showing changes in soil moisture, so from a 2-year time period. And on the right here, we're looking at maps of what we call active layer thickness, which is a way for us to see how thick the permafrost is in an area. So areas that are blue have high permafrost, and areas that are red are areas where we have low permafrost. And we make these measurements every year or two, so we're able to go back and see where is permafrost changing, how is this landscape changing over time. And another aspect that we're really trying to study in this region is where do we see changes in vegetation? And so this is a map showing areas that are getting greener, where we might have more shrubs or more trees, and areas that are browning, maybe where we're seeing a drought and trees or shrubs are dying back. And there are a couple of these different types of maps. They're called greening and browning maps. And they can be difficult to understand because sometimes you may have trees that have died off due to an insect outbreak, but perhaps shrubs have come back there. So it might actually look greener, even though you've lost some carbon because there's less trees. So in those situations, we are using these little white lines across here are the our airborne instruments where we've actually gone out and made measurements. And then we're able to use those measurements to really understand aspects of vegetation across the landscape. So here's a map just looking at biomass. This is understanding where trees are, how many trees there are, and how they've changed over time. So this is a map from 2020. This researcher also is making a map from 2000. So really trying to understand how this region is changing. We do the same with looking at carbon. Where is there more carbon? Where is there less? We do this with a combination of field data, such as these towers you install out in the ground on the right, and also with field measurements that you can see on the left. These are just different places where researchers have actually gone out and taken readings of carbon dioxide in the air at the ground, and we're trying to put all that together and understand what's happening in these northern regions. And what we're finding is that right now, this Arctic and boreal region across the entire world, really, going circumpolar around into Russia and Siberia as well. This area is still a carbon sink despite everything that's been happening there. However, it's starting to shift towards a net carbon source where we're seeing more carbon put out from this region than is being taken back in through plants growing. So as permafrost thaws and this older carbon is released into the atmosphere, and as fires come through and we burn some of this carbon and it's released into the atmosphere, we're resulting in shifting this region from a sink of carbon, a place where carbon goes and is stored, so it's no longer in our atmosphere, to a place where we have more of it coming out. And one way we see that is with methane. Methane is more potent than carbon dioxide, but it doesn't last in the atmosphere as long. But we do see a number of different methane emissions. This was just an animation of methane as it's released, but I wanted to show it a little bit along an area. This is a lake in Alaska where we've taken methane measurements with teams on the ground, and then we've scaled it up with some of our airborne instruments and looked at this entire region and trying to look at it across this larger area to see where is there methane across Alaska. And we're going to go to the next one. This is what methane can look like. As permafrost areas start to thaw, methane in lakes actually starts to bubble up. And if you're wondering, oh, how do you know that that's methane and not just some little air bubbles that are coming out of the lake? Well, let me show you on the next slide how we know. Okay, these are what these bubbles look like in winter. They actually get frozen into the surface of the lake. And here's how we know that it's a flammable gas. We have teams that actually go out and they can light them on fire. And I've actually done this, and not quite as extreme as this example, but I have lit some of these little bubbles on fire, and you can see that they actually are a flammable methane gas that's just being released into the atmosphere. So this is people doing this work on the ground, which we then can scale up to this airborne level, and then of course into our satellite monitoring. I just have a few more minutes left, so I want to make sure there's time for questions. So I'll just again say about fire, smoke, and health in this region. We have a team of researchers that's looking at how smoke from wildland fires is influencing people going to the hospital. And so they were able to get anonymized hospital data from the time of wildfires to see if there's an uptick in people going to the hospital for respiratory issues or whatnot due to wildfires, trying to look at that in a little bit more depth. And thinking about how does this impact people outside of the Arctic area too. There are a lot of animals that migrate from the areas in the north down to other parts of the country and even into South America as well. So these boreal songbirds are one example. And so this picture on the right, this is our space robin. One of our team drew this, and we actually have a team that puts collars on birds. They put tracking devices on birds, and then they track them along their migratory pathways. And we see changes with that. And then we are also looking at other wildlife as well and tracking the movement of the wildlife and how it's changing over time. And with climate change, some of these movements are changing. There's a team that put together a database of animal movement, and it's got millions of records. And so this is kind of a showcase of some of these types of species. We have marine mammals in red and raptors in green, terrestrial mammals, that's like moose and caribou and foxes and whatnot in yellow, and really just tracking the movement of these species over time. And the data sets come from not just our NASA researchers, but people all over the globe are contributing to this data set. You can see again those marine mammals and the seabirds, how they move. This here, as we zoom in on this yellow, this is mostly moose tracks, and you can actually see them as they track sometimes along the roads, which can be dangerous for people if they're trying to drive. So I won't show all of that video. But I'm coming here to the end of my talk, and I know some of what I've shown can create some climate anxiety. You know, we're seeing changes with sea surface temperature and permafrost and whatnot. Well, what can we do about it? And so I think one of the best things we can do, and you're actually already doing it, is to educate ourselves, to learn more. And I have a slide at the end that has a link to a page at NASA you can go to. But if you ever find yourself in the Washington, D.C. area, and we're not in the midst of a government shutdown, you can visit the Earth Information Center at NASA. And this is kind of an immersive experience where you can go and kind of see data sets about Earth visualized at NASA headquarters right down in DC. And this just opened. I actually haven't even gotten a chance to go down and check it out myself, but some of my friends have gone and have really enjoyed it. If you also, another way to get involved is the Globe Explorer program. And this is an app on your cell phone where you can participate in citizen science. They have one of the parts of this app, you can look at clouds and try to track where clouds are. You can go out during the day and take a picture of clouds and send the information to NASA. And it's designed to be very simple and easy to use. And even if you're not sure exactly what type of cloud it is, the app can help you figure that out. And then that can be compared with satellite imagery that we are getting of clouds, and it can help to make our models of clouds better and understanding precipitation better. They have a similar part of the app for mosquitoes and land cover and even understanding trees. And so that's a way that people can get involved and help to make the science even better. And then we have this new website called climate.nasa.gov you can go to, and it kind of showcases how much carbon is in the atmosphere and what the global temperature is and what the sea level is, how much of the sea level has risen, and you can kind of navigate through different parts of the website to learn more. I've tried to put a few links in my presentation as well. There's some websites that just give daily views of imagery and called Earth Explorer, and you can kind of zoom around and check things out there too. So I think that is all I really wanted to share with everyone. And I'm happy to take some questions or to hear any thoughts that you have as well. So thank you very much for having me come today, and it was really a joy to get to present this.
So folks, let's give Liz a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. And let's take approximately, let's say 10 minutes of audience questions. Let's see here. So Teresa says, this is absolutely fascinating. Such complicated subject imparted so everyone can understand and be interested. Deborah loved this. Diane says, thank you. It was wonderful and insightful. Karen says, your job sounds really cool to gather all of this information. Judy says, this was interesting and educational. Madeline says, it was an excellent program and very important. Frank says, bravo. I'll circle back to some of the other comments later on.
These are great. I love these comments. You keep them coming.
Exactly. Let's jump into some questions here.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm going to ask these in somewhat of a chronological order.
Okay.
First question, how is NASA trying to specifically support poor and low socioeconomic countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to more effectively fight the negative impacts of climate change?
Yeah, that's a really great question. NASA does have an environmental justice focus area now, which I didn't really mention in this talk so much. But one of the goals there is to really try to make sure we're providing science and support for really everyone who needs it. But going along with that, one program I can think of off the top of my head is that we provide information about active wildfires to wildfire managers, so to land managers. And when this program was first created, it was done in a way where we could actually get information onto people's cell phones quickly. So if there's an active fire in a land manager's region that they're monitoring, that information is automatically sent to a cell phone. And the reason it goes to a cell phone, one of the reasons, is because some countries in Africa, when this program first came out, people didn't always have a reliable and stable internet connection, but they had a cell phone and they had data so that they could get the information when they needed it. So that's one little small piece. And NASA also has it's called NASA Harvest. It's an applied sciences campaign to look at agriculture and harvest information. And a lot of that is tailored to look also at food security issues across some of the developing countries as well.
Excellent. And that question, I might mispronounce this, that was from Shmumel. I'm probably getting that wrong, so I apologize. But there we go. Let me see here. So lots of questions from Deborah. Deborah, I promise we'll circle back to some of your questions. I do want to give everyone an opportunity. Nancy says, you showed about 20 NASA satellites. With all the satellites from so many countries, who or how are the satellites programmed to avoid collisions?
That's a good question, one that I kind of wonder about a little bit myself. And I think that even though we have 20 satellites that are, NASA or NASA partner satellites, and there are others out there from other countries, the Earth is so large and the orbits around them are so big. So it's not just kind of spaced apart from one another in like the horizontal direction, but also the vertical direction. So some of them might be higher than the others, or lower, or closer to the Earth, or farther away from the Earth. So they're still not running into each other because there's so much space that they're spread out far enough from one another. It is something to think about.
Semi-related question from Joe. How do you get permission from countries like China to fly overhead and use pictures of their land?
So I think there are some places that are maybe not imaged, but I think that's probably over my head. I think some of it's governed by perhaps international treaties, or also I think just we're able to put our satellite up there and we make this data freely available. Actually, users from China are one of the largest groups that actually are downloading a lot of the data sets that we have, because some of our archive centers, they track kind of what country you're coming from when you download data, and a lot of it is downloaded from other countries that not even the US, but we do make that data set available to everyone.
All right, let me circle back to some of Deborah's questions. These are somewhat off. A few of them are off topic, kind of, sort of. I'm not sure, but you don't get to talk to a NASA employee, a not NASA scientist, so very often. So let me ask at least a couple of these here. So Deborah asks, is NASA seeing a lot of fracking earthquakes in the United States?
Now that one I don't know about as well. Other agencies track earthquakes in more depth, but what we do is we can come in after an earthquake and try to look at kind of maybe where there's landslides or where there might be damages. But I think it'd probably be other groups that are actually looking at where earthquakes are happening the most and what
Sure.
their causes are.
And you may have a similar answer to this question, but it wouldn't be a NASA Solar System Ambassador program without a question about the moon. And Deborah asks, do you think that mining the moon will impact the ocean tides and severity of ocean storms? Will it impact the Earth and moon's gravitational pull?
That's another really interesting question. And unfortunately, I don't get to study that part of things so much, but I think that should definitely factor into work that's done, is thinking about what are the kind of impacts that are not as easily thought about but could be there.
All right, so I'm going to cross those off the list. So Deborah, I got to several of your questions. So let's go back here.
There are some in the webinar chat too, I see too.
Okay. Yep, absolutely. I think a question that Brian has that a lot of other folks have asked, sort of along these lines, and again, this might be beyond you, but do you feel that climate change is it too late to stop climate change? Is essentially the question.
Well, you can see what I still have up on the screen here. We've really increased our carbon dioxide, our global temperature has continued to rise. And the last few years have been the warmest years on record consistently. We continue to go up. Sea level is going up. So there are some serious consequences that we have had from climate change, especially since the world started to industrialize back in the late 1800s. And where do we go from here? I think you all are doing the first step, which is to think about this as a community. And at NASA, we're just trying to bring the science together and make it available for people to see and think about. I personally I'm a scientist at NASA, but then I'm also a parent and I'm also a volunteer in my community. So I try to take the information that I learn and share it wherever I can. And I would encourage everyone to do that so we can all think together how we move forward and what kind of changes we can make so that we can, help to bring some of this climate change back to where we had it before. But I think it's going to be an effort from everyone to make it happen.
And that question was actually from Brian's daughter, Cecilia. So I will correct myself there. Let me see here. What has above found is causing the change in the ecosystems?
I think that the global climate change, the global temperatures rising, is a big part of it. And what happens in those regions is that we have a positive feedback cycle. So as climate changes, as temperatures rise, we set up conditions for more fires and more permafrost thaw. And then as we have fires in this fall, we're releasing more carbon into the atmosphere, which is causing temperatures to rise, which then can cause more fires. So we see this cycle where we have more fire and more warming. And so I think that that's one of the big issues that's happening in Arctic regions.
Okay, so many questions, but I think they're like kind of related, kind of not related. I don't know what to ask. I do want to ask, as we start to wind down, we're coming up on 3 o'clock. Scott wants to learn a little bit more about you, Liz. How did you become a scientist at NASA, and what was your career path like?
I started out working on a master's degree in geography. And while I was there, my advisor asked if I wanted to keep studying. And I said, sure, let's go ahead and do that. So I stayed and worked on a PhD. I got to go to Alaska and hike around in the wilderness there. I would go in after a fire happened, like a year after. So I was not around any active fires. I'd go in and we'd dig in the soil, try to understand how deeply these fires burned. And it really just kind of grew out from there. I started to work on this campaign called Above about a little bit more than 10 years ago when we started to conceptualize it. And it's been really just a joy to get to be a part of this program where so many scientists are all coming together to try to tackle this issue together, both on the ground and with our planes, and then of course using our satellite data. So it's really exciting for me to kind of see all this research coming together. And we really have closed some of the gaps in our understanding through this 10-year campaign of focused effort, which is really exciting.
All right, that's probably a good question to end on, but I'm going to try to sneak two more through here. So
Okay.
Rich wants to know, hopefully these are quick ones. Rich wants to know regarding sea temperature, is subsurface temperatures changing too, as far down as 100 feet or 1,000 feet?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that probably would require somebody who's more skilled than I am in kind of the sea surface understanding to be able to sense to tell you the answer there. I can tell you in terms of what we're seeing with our satellites, we're really just looking at sea surface temperature, so we're not getting that far down under the surface of the water. It's a good question.
Brian asks, do most NASA facilities run on eco-friendly power?
That's another good question. I know that in part of our NASA strategic plan, we are trying to go to more sustainable choices. And we at NASA Goddard in Maryland, where I work, we have some efforts to try to reduce our power usage, especially on high energy use days, like with air conditioners and whatnot. And they've developed some strategies to work on that. So I think that NASA is working towards that. I do think it's part of our long-term planning.
All right, so I'm going to jump back to the chat. You did answer Karen's questions about solutions. Frank says, bravo, excellent presentation. Marianne says, this was great. I'm going to DC soon, and I will check out the EIC. But Beatrice says,
only
thank
on
you
weekdays, though. Monday through Friday, weekday hours. It's not open on weekends.
There we go.
Yeah.
And let's hope the government doesn't shut down.
I know. Yes, please.
Dario says, thank you for the information. Excellent slides. Amazing. Beatrice appreciated the details and the photos you shared. Maxine says, thanks for your timely and important presentation on climate change. Rich says, nice job. Scott says, good to know that there are people in our federal government that are trying to understand and solve the climate problems before it's too late. Brian says, thank you. Nancy says, this presentation has been wonderful. I previously linked NASA with space and not with Earth at all. I'm very grateful to learn all that you presented. Thank you very much. Karen has similar thoughts. Frank says, great. Thank you for your work. Thank you to all your NASA colleagues as well. And Cecilia says that this was so fun, and thanks for the information and your time. So Liz, any last words before we end the session?
I just want to say thank you all so much for having me come, and I really appreciate everyone's time. And I hope you now do go and explore more and think about the world around you and how we all fit into it. Thank you again.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Look for an email from me later today with a link to the recording, a link to a feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming programs that are somewhat related that might be of interest. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, Liz. Nice to meet you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.